Poitiers, the year 1356. This was not a battle. This was the moment an entire civilization of war began to collapse. Because on that day, a king was taken alive. Two armies faced each other in the field south of Poitiers. One was exhausted, outnumbered, hunted for months. 6,000 to 7,000 English soldiers, hungry, wounded, holding ground they had not chosen for glory, but for survival. The other marched with banners, armor, and confidence. 15,000 to 20,000 French troops, the nobility of a kingdom. And at their center, King John II of France himself. One side fought to endure, the other fought to preserve honor. And somewhere between hedges, narrow lanes, and broken ground, those two ideas collided. Arrows would not need to pierce armor. Steel would not need to shatter. The human body would fail first. Because Poitiers was not about who won the field. It was about what happens when an entire kingdom steps into a space it can no longer control. Stay with this story to understand how a nation was taken prisoner on a single afternoon. To understand Poitiers, we must return to a Europe already cracking under pressure. The Hundred Years' War had begun in 1337, when Edward III of England claimed the French crown. What followed was not a single conflict, but a slow war of legitimacy, authority, and pride. In 1346, France suffered a catastrophe at Crécy. Soon after, Calais fell into English hands. The shock was immense, but it was never fully absorbed. The French crown did not rebuild its military system. It explained defeat as misfortune, weather, bad luck. To admit structural failure would have meant admitting that the knightly order itself was flawed, an idea the nobility could not accept. A decade later, Edward's son entered the stage. Edward of Woodstock, remembered as the Black Prince, launched a chevauchée from Aquitaine. This was not a conquest. It was calculated destruction. Villages were burned, granaries emptied, local authority collapsed in real time. Modern historians describe chevauchée as economic warfare. Contemporary observers saw something even more dangerous, a direct attack on royal credibility. If the king could not protect his land, he could not claim loyalty. John II of France had no real choice. Politically, inaction meant weakness. Socially, retreat meant dishonor. Among the nobility, it meant the slow death of royal authority. Chronicles of the period describe the French response not as a campaign, but as a royal hunt. The French army believed it was the pursuer, that it was closing in. The English were running out of space. What it didn't understand was that the hunted had already chosen where the pursuit would end. Poitiers was not a meeting of armies. It was the point where a kingdom was forced to fight. On the ground, it did not control. By the time the armies reached Poitiers, the English knew one truth with absolute clarity. They could not win by force. They stopped retreating, not because they were ready to fight, but because there was nowhere left to run. The Black Prince chose ground that strangled movement. Narrow lanes, hedges and vines, broken fields where formations collapsed into one another. This was not defensive brilliance meant to destroy an enemy quickly. It was preparation for endurance. English men-at-arms dismounted, not as a gesture of humility, but as a rejection of spectacle. On foot, they were stable, disciplined, able to hold a position without chasing glory. Longbowmen were placed to fire in overlapping arcs, not to break armor, but to control time. Modern military theory would call this tempo control. Medieval chroniclers simply observed that the English did not advance. They waited. The French prepared for a very different kind of battle. They arrived in overwhelming numbers, heavy armor, and confidence shaped by centuries of nightly warfare. Their army was divided into successive attacks, not because it was tactically ideal, but because the structure of the French nobility demanded it. Each noble retinue expected its moment. Each leader sought distinction. Unity existed on paper, not in motion. French commanders believed momentum would solve everything. That weight, honor, and courage would crush resistance once contact was made. What they did not account for was the cost of their own equipment. Modern biomechanics explains what medieval observers could only describe. As exertion increases under heavy load, oxygen intake drops. Heat builds. Muscle efficiency collapses. Armor protects the body, but it also traps it. At Poitiers, the longbow did not need to kill. It needed to interrupt breathing, to force sudden movement, to break alignment. As formation slowed, stress multiplied. As stress increased, cohesion vanished. Steel had not failed. Weapons had not failed. But the human system inside the armor was already beginning to fracture. And when the first line stepped forward, the outcome was no longer uncertain. When the French advance began, it did not look like a disaster. The first lines moved forward with banners raised, armor gleaming, convinced that momentum would carry them through. But the ground narrowed. The lanes constricted. Movement slowed before anyone realized it. Then the arrows began to fall, not in a single storm, but without pause. Horses were struck first. Some screamed and collapsed where they stood. Others panicked, crashing sideways into men behind them. Within minutes, the approach routes began to clog. Bodies and broken animals became obstacles that no order could remove. French infantry pressed on, forced forward by the weight of those behind them. Armor soaked with sweat and mud grew heavier with every step. Men stumbled easily. And when they fell, standing again required space that no longer existed. Those who went down were stepped over, or stepped on. The formation did not shatter. It froze. In the narrow ground before Poitiers, there was no room to redeploy, no space to regain alignment. The army could only move forward, or not move at all. English arrows continued to cut through the mass, not killing in waves, but eroding coordination. Every pause increased pressure. Every delay multiplied confusion. And then the line lost its shape. This was the moment the English had waited for. A small, disciplined force moved from the flank, not in a glorious charge, not with banners flying, just enough force. At the exact moment the French line could no longer respond. The effect was immediate. Once the edge collapsed, the center followed. Once movement failed in one section, panic spread to the next. This was not a rout caused by fear. It was a collapse caused by congestion. French units could not see what was happening ahead. Orders could not travel backward. Signals were swallowed by noise, armor, and terrain. What remained was not an army, but thousands of individuals are trapped inside the same space. King John II fought where he stood. Multiple contemporary sources, including Jean Froissart and the Chandos Herald, record that the king refused to flee. He struck at those who approached him. He stayed on his feet long after the line around him had disappeared. But courage could not restore structure. As English troops closed in, the battlefield had already decided the outcome. The system that supported command had failed minutes earlier. Surrounded, cut off, exhausted. The King of France was taken alive. And with that moment, the battle ended, even as the fighting continued. From that instant forward, this was no longer a question of victory or defeat. It became a question of ransom, politics, and national survival. The battle ended at Poitiers, but its consequences stretched far beyond the field. French losses were not measured only in bodies. They were measured in titles, lineages, and command. Hundreds of nobles were killed or captured. Entire regions lost their lords in a single afternoon. The local authority vanished almost overnight. What remained was a hollow structure. A kingdom with soldiers, but without leadership. King John II was taken into English custody, not hidden away, but displayed as proof that the French crown itself had been seized. Without a king, decision-making stalled. Rival factions maneuvered, trust eroded between the court and the provinces. To raise ransom, taxes increased. Coin was extracted from towns already scarred by war. Discontent spread downward and outward. Peasant revolts followed. Urban unrest flared. The state paid for defeat year after year. In 1360, the Treaty of Bretigny formalized what Poitiers had already decided. France surrendered vast territories and agreed to a ransom so large it would burden generations. This was not diplomacy. It was a ledger, a delayed payment plan for a single lost battle. From that moment on, France was no longer fighting merely to win a war, but to recover from one afternoon when its ruler was taken alive. One king captured meant an entire nation would keep paying. Long after the arrows had stopped falling, Poitiers did not invent a new way of war. It confirmed that France had refused to accept. Crécy had already exposed the weakness. Poitiers proved it was systemic. The problem was never courage. It was an organization. After 1356, European warfare moved, slowly, unevenly, toward discipline, coordination, and control of tempo. Armies that could hold position, regulate movement, and absorb pressure began to matter more than those built on individual valor. France would adapt, but only after years of humiliation and loss. Poitiers also revealed something far more dangerous than tactical failure. In medieval Europe, the king was more than a commander. He was the state made visible. At Poitiers, that visibility became vulnerability. When John II was captured, authority did not merely pause. It fractured. Power is dispersed among factions. Loyalty became conditional. Governance turned reactive. The battlefield had shown what political theory had not yet admitted. A monarchy centered on a single body could be seized, and with it, the nation's future. The consequences lingered long after the fighting stopped. Years of ransom payments, territorial concessions, internal unrest that reshaped French society. This was not the cost of defeat alone. It was the cost of failing to adapt when the environment had already changed. Poitiers offers no heroic lesson, only a cold one. Honor cannot replace adjustment. Past success cannot defend against new conditions. And systems that refuse to evolve do not break all at once. They collapse under pressure they no longer understand. Crécy cracked the myth of invincible knighthood. Poitiers captured the state itself. And from that moment on, European warfare would never return to what it had been. If you want me to continue examining battles where entire systems fall, not just armies, leave a single dot below and share this story